Quebec and Hartford didn't lose their hockey teams. The NHL took them.
A final road trip today for the Quebec Nordiques. They're off to the U.S. and they will not be coming back. The NHL team has been sold to a company based in Denver.
Two cities that packed arenas in January, that built rosters good enough to win championships, that treated the sport like it was woven into the whole identity of the place. The league looked at both, did the math, and decided they weren't worth saving. Then it walked away. There are two ways a city loses a hockey team, and Quebec got the version that leaves a scar on the whole identity of the place. Because what happened there was never really about hockey. The Nordiques existed inside a city that had spent the better part of 2 decades arguing for its own survival. Quebec City in the 1980s and early 1990s wasn't just another provincial capital. It was the emotional center of a separatist movement, a place where language and culture and political identity all pressed against each other every single day, and where having your own NHL franchise meant something that went far beyond wins and losses. Montreal had the Canadiens, had always had them, and Montreal was the city the rest of the world thought of when it thought of Quebec. The Nordiques were the answer to that. They were the proof that Quebec City could stand on its own, that you didn't need to be Montreal to matter inside this sport, and the fans who showed up at the Colisée treated every home game like a declaration of independence, whether the team was winning or not. The rivalry with the Canadiens made all of that visible. 5 playoff series between 1982 and 1993, and not one of them felt like a normal hockey matchup, because they weren't. When Quebec and Montreal met in April, it was a proxy war dressed in jerseys. Francophone against Francophone, city against city, 2 versions of what it meant to be Quebecois slamming into each other along the boards. The Colisée held about 15,000 people, which is small by NHL standards, and visiting teams talked about it the way road teams in college basketball talk about Cameron Indoor. The noise was disproportionate to the building, the crowd was right on top of you, and on nights when the temperature outside dropped to -30 and the fans still packed the place, the atmosphere inside could genuinely rattle a game plan before the puck even dropped. Now, hold Quebec in your mind and meet Hartford, because Hartford is a completely different kind of grief. The Whalers were never supposed to be anyone's primary allegiance. New England already had the Bruins, Boston was right there, and Hartford knew from the beginning that it was the second hockey city in its own region. The fans who chose the Whalers chose them anyway, which is a specific kind of loyalty that doesn't get enough credit. The decision to love the team that nobody outside your city takes seriously, the one that plays in a smaller building and drafts well and still can't quite break through, and you show up for them, not because they're prestigious, but because they're yours. The Brass Bonanza played after every goal. Those green and blue jerseys became one of the most iconic looks in professional sports, and there was a joy in that arena that had nothing to do with expectations and everything to do with belonging. What makes both stories unbearable is the same detail. Both franchises in their final years were building something extraordinary, and neither city got to keep it. Quebec assembled its roster through a stretch of high draft picks and one trade that rewrote the franchise overnight. Eric Lindros was selected first overall in 1991, refused to play for the Nordiques, and held out for an entire year until the team traded him to Philadelphia in a deal that returned Peter Forsberg, Mike Ricci, Chris Simon, Ron Hextall, Steve Deschênes, 2 first-round picks, and $15 million in cash. 8 pieces for 1 player. That is the kind of haul that changes a franchise for a generation. And when you combine those pieces with Joe Sakic, who had been drafted back in 1987 and was already one of the best players in the league, what Quebec had on its hands was a team that could win multiple championships. They knew it. Everyone knew it. Hartford's version was quieter, but followed the same arc. The Whalers were developing young talent, building a core that had a real upward trajectory, and the players who came through that system would go on to win a Stanley Cup, just not in Hartford and not as Whalers. Both cities did the work of building a contender and then watched someone else collect the reward. But stop here, because before any of that mattered, before the moving trucks, before the press conferences, before fans in 2 different cities woke up one morning and found out their team was gone, Something had already happened inside the NHL's front office that made all of it possible, and nobody was paying attention to it at the time. In the early 1990s, the league went on an expansion binge that reshaped the entire geography of professional hockey. San Jose came in during 1991. Ottawa and Tampa Bay followed in 1992. Florida and Anaheim arrived in 1993. Each one of those ownership groups paid between $45 and $50 million for the privilege of joining the NHL. And by the time Nashville, Atlanta, Columbus, and Minnesota entered later in the decade at $80 million apiece, the league had collected a staggering amount of expansion revenue from markets that had little or no hockey tradition. The money flowed south and west, into Sunbelt cities with new arenas, growing populations, and television contracts that the league's existing small market Canadian teams could never match. That was not an accident. That was a strategy, and it had a cost. And that cost was going to land on the cities least equipped to absorb it. Quebec's wound was specific and had almost nothing to do with hockey operations. The Canadian dollar fell to roughly 72 cents against the US dollar by the mid-1990s, which meant that every player contract the Nordiques paid, every operating expense, every arena maintenance bill, was suddenly worth significantly less in a league where revenue was measured in American currency. The franchise was hemorrhaging millions per season on the exchange rate alone, and there was no mechanism inside the NHL to offset that because the league had never built one. This was not mismanagement. Marcel Aubut was not running the team into the ground. This was monetary policy doing what monetary policy does, and it was happening to every Canadian franchise at once. And the NHL's response was to treat it as someone else's problem. Aubut went to the league and asked for the one thing that might have saved the Nordiques: meaningful revenue sharing, some formal structure that acknowledged Canadian teams were competing under fundamentally different financial conditions than their American counterparts. He didn't ask for charity. He asked the league to function like a league, to protect its own members in the way every other major sports organization in North America was starting to figure out. What came back from the commissioner's office changed everything. Hartford's problem looked different on paper, but ended up in the same place. There was no currency gap in Connecticut. The issue was a 15,000-seat arena that generated some of the lowest gate revenue in the league. An owner in Pete Karmanos who had purchased the team in 1994 with no particular commitment to keeping it in Hartford, and a state government that moved too slowly on a new arena deal when speed was the only thing that could have changed the outcome. Karmanos told the state exactly what he needed and gave them a real deadline, and when the state's offer finally came together, Karmanos was already gone. He had not bought the Whalers to save them. He had bought the Whalers to move them, and the delay gave him the cover to do it. Gary Bettman's answer, in substance if not in those exact words, was that franchise viability was an ownership problem, not a league problem. The NHL would not intervene. If Aubut couldn't make the numbers work in Quebec City, that was on Aubut. The league had made its position clear. You're on your own. And now the math took over. When Comsat Entertainment Group came to Aubut with an offer to buy the Nordiques and relocate them to Denver, Aubut sold for $75 million. The transaction closed in May 1995, and what makes it so difficult to sit with is the roster he was handing over. This was not a teardown. This was not a franchise on life support. The Nordiques had just finished first in the entire Eastern Conference. They had Sakic and Forsberg and Kamensky and Deadmarsh and Ricci, and the team Aubut sold was built to compete for Stanley Cups for the next half-decade at minimum. He took the money because the math said he had no choice, and the league that could have intervened had already told him it wouldn't. The players Quebec had assembled, through years of losing, through the Lindros trade, through patient development, moved to Colorado and won the Stanley Cup in their very first season in Denver. 1 year. That's how close Quebec City was to celebrating a championship. The core that the Colisée had watched grow up became a dynasty 2,000 miles away, and the fans who had packed that building through everything got to watch it happen on television in different jerseys in a city that had contributed nothing to the process of building it. 2 years later, Hartford followed. On May 6, 1997, Peter Karmanos announced the Whalers were moving to Raleigh, North Carolina, where they would become the Carolina Hurricanes. Whether the state's timeline was genuinely bad luck or something Karmanos had engineered to make the departure look inevitable is a question Hartford fans have been asking for 3 decades. The Civic Center went dark, the Brass Bonanza stopped playing, and another franchise vanished through a process that gave the city no voice at all. And the players who had spent years building those rosters, the ones who'd given those cities something worth losing, most of them never got an explanation either. Both relocations were approved by the Board of Governors, but neither required a public hearing, a community impact review, or any process that gave the cities being gutted a voice in the room. The votes were rubber stamps dressed up as governance, and by the time the announcements came, there was nothing left to fight. The league had structured its own rules so that losing a franchise was something that happened to a city the way weather happens. You could see it coming, you could prepare for it, and none of that mattered because nobody with the authority to stop it had any reason to try. What Quebec and Hartford learned simultaneously is the same lesson, and it's a brutal one. You can have a full building, you can have a competitive team, you can have a fan base that would run through a wall for the logo on the front of the jersey. None of it constitutes a floor. If the owner wants to leave and the money says go, the team goes, and the city gets a press conference and a long silence afterward. The NHL collected hundreds of millions in expansion fees across the 1990s, almost all of it from Sunbelt ownership groups buying into new markets. Not one meaningful dollar of that revenue was redistributed to stabilize the small market Canadian franchises that were bleeding out while the league grew around them. Quebec and Hartford subsidized the expansion that replaced them, and that is not an exaggeration. The human cost was not abstract. Ron Francis had been Hartford's captain for the better part of a decade, the franchise's all-time leading scorer, the player they drafted 4th overall in 1981 and built their identity around for 10 years before trading him to Pittsburgh in 1991. He won 2 Stanley Cups with the Penguins and eventually came back to the organization, but by then it was the Carolina Hurricanes, and Hartford was already gone. The team that made him, the city that loved him first, had simply ceased to exist. Mats Sundin was traded out of Quebec in 1994, 1 year before the move, and then watched the franchise he'd been drafted to represent win a championship in Colorado without him, wearing different colors, playing for a fan base that had inherited everything Quebec had built. In Quebec City, the wound went deeper than the loss of a hockey team, because the Nordiques had never been just a hockey team. They were municipal identities. They were the thing that made Quebec City feel like it mattered on a national stage independent of Montreal. And when the franchise left, that sense of relevance left with it. A new arena opened in 2015, 2 decades later, built specifically to lure the NHL back, and the league still hasn't come. The relocations of Quebec and Hartford were not isolated events. They established a template that the NHL would follow for the next 30 years. A financially stressed franchise, a league unwilling to intervene, an owner with a better offer from a bigger market, and a fan base told this was simply how business works. That same template played out in Atlanta twice, in Phoenix for the better part of 2 decades, and in every small market city that has ever looked at its NHL franchise and wondered whether it would still be there in 5 years. Quebec and Hartford were the proof of concept, the first demonstration that loyalty, history, and passion carry no structural weight inside a league that measures viability in revenue per seat. The league grew. The Sunbelt franchises got their arenas, their expansion fees, and their television markets. And the 2 most historically authentic hockey markets the NHL ever walked away from are still waiting for someone to explain why it had to be them. You were promised the story of why 2 viable franchises disappeared in the same window, and the answer was never complicated. It was math. The league ran the numbers, decided Quebec and Hartford didn't fit the future it was building, and let the math win. No explanation that ever had to survive public scrutiny. If this is the kind of story you came here for, joining the Healthy Scratch membership keeps them coming. Priority replies, loyalty badges, exclusive emojis. Next time, a player who gave the league everything it asked for and got silence in return. Subscribe.